The October sun hung low over the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the weathered boardwalks. The air tasted of alkali dust and distant rain that would never quite reach this parched corner of Wyoming territory. It was the kind of afternoon that made folks hurry their business, eager to escape the bite of the coming winter wind. Ethan Carter stood outside Morrison's general store, his calloused hands wrapped around a length of rope he'd been meaning to buy for the better part of an hour. At 27, he cut an imposing figure, broad shoulders earned from years of ranch work, sun-weathered skin that spoke of countless days under the unforgiving sky, and eyes the color of storm clouds that rarely showed what lay beneath. His father's recent passing had left him with more than just grief. It had saddled him with a failing ranch and debts that threatened to swallow everything the old man had built. The weekly stage from Cheyenne rolled into town with its usual fanfare dust clouds, creaking wheels, and the driver's colorful cursing at his team of horses. Ethan barely glanced up from his rope until he heard the commotion. "This her?" a voice bellowed across the street. "This the one you sent for?" Ethan's attention snapped to the scene unfolding near the stage depot. Samuel Harland, a local farmer known more for his temper than his crops, stood with his arms crossed, glaring at a young woman who had just descended from the coach. She couldn't have been more than 23, with auburn hair pinned beneath a travel-worn bonnet and a blue calico dress that had seen better days. Her small hands clutched a carpet bag as if it held her entire world, which, Ethan reckoned, it probably did. Mr. Harland." The woman's voice carried a slight tremor, though she held her chin high. "I'm Margaret Dawson. Your intended." Margaret, even from across the street. Ethan could see the hope flickering in her green eyes, the careful way she'd pressed her dress that morning, trying to make the best impression despite days of travel. She was pretty in that delicate Eastern way that wouldn't last a season out here without hardening or breaking. Samuel circled her like a wolf sizing up prey, his boots kicking up little clouds of dust. "You ain't what your letters said. Said you were blonde. Said you could cook and keep house." "I can cook," Margaret said quickly. "And I am blonde, sir." "It's just the dust from traveling has darkened." "Don't look blonde to me." Samuel spat tobacco juice dangerously close to her worn boots. "Looks red. My ma always said redheads bring nothing but trouble." A crowd had begun to gather, the usual collection of townspeople hungry for drama. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, the Jennings boys who worked at the livery. Even old Doc Whelan peered out from his office window. Ethan recognized the look in their eyes, the same mixture of pity and cruel fascination that accompanied any public humiliation in a small town. "Please, Mr. Harland." Margaret's voice dropped lower, but in the stillness of the street, everyone could hear. "I've come all this way. I sold everything I had for the passage. Your letters said—" "I don't care what the letters said." Samuel's face had turned the color of raw beef. "You lied, made yourself out to be something you ain't. Probably can't even read. Just had someone write them letters for you." "That's not true." For the first time, fire flashed in Margaret's eyes. "I wrote every word myself. I'm educated. I taught school in Philadelphia before—" "A schoolmarm," Samuel laughed, ugly and harsh. "That's even worse. What use I got for some uppity Eastern woman who thinks she's better than honest folks? Can you birth calves? Can you work a field from dawn to dusk? Can you?" He reached for her bag, whether to throw it back on the stage or just to emphasize his point. Ethan never found out, because that's when his own boots started moving, carrying him across the street before his mind had fully decided on the action. "That's enough, Harland." Ethan's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade through burlap. He positioned himself between Samuel and Margaret, close enough to smell the whiskey on the farmer's breath. "This ain't your concern, Carter." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "This is between me and this lying woman." "Doesn't look like she's lying about anything except maybe having the poor judgment to answer your advertisement." Ethan kept his voice level. though his fists ached to connect with Samuel's jaw. Woman travels halfway across the country on a promise. Least you can do is treat her with basic decency. Decency? Samuel's laugh was bitter. You gonna lecture me about decency? Boy, your PA not even cold in the ground and you're already letting his ranch go to seed. Maybe you should mind your own failing business. The mention of his father sent a spike of pain through Ethan's chest, but he didn't let it show. My business is mine, but I won't stand by and watch you treat any woman like a head of cattle you're dissatisfied with. Margaret had gone very still behind him, her breathing quick and shallow. The crowd pressed closer, sensing the possibility of violence. In a town starved for entertainment, a fight between two prominent ranchers' sons would be talked about for months. You want her? Samuel's grin turned vicious. You take her then. Take in another man's reject. Seems fitting, considering you're living in another man's shadow. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a prairie fire. Ethan's hand instinctively moved toward his hip, though he hadn't worn his pistol to town. Just as well the last thing he needed was a murder charge on top of everything else. Get on home. Harland, you've made your decision. For a moment, it seemed Samuel might push the issue. Then he spat again, this time deliberately hitting Ethan's boot. Trash belongs with trash, he muttered, shouldering past toward the saloon. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed at the lack of bloodshed but already spinning the story into something more dramatic for later telling. Ethan stood still until the street had mostly cleared, aware of the woman behind him like an ember against his back. Finally, he turned. Margaret Dawson stood exactly where she'd been, still clutching her carpet bag, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Up close, he could see she was prettier than he'd first thought, with fine features and intelligent eyes that held both devastation and a desperate attempt at dignity. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He'd acted on instinct, but now the reality of the situation settled on him like a heavy blanket. "You got anywhere to go, family to wire?" She shook her head, a jerky movement that sent a few pins tumbling from her hair. "I used everything for the passage. My sister, she died last winter. There's no one." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. No money, no family, no options. In a frontier town, a woman alone might as well paint a target on her back. The boarding house would want payment up front, the only other establishments that would take her. Ethan's jaw tightened at the thought. "Hell," he muttered under his breath. Then, louder, "You can't stay in town, not after this. They'll make your life miserable." "I'll find work. I can teach, or cook, or—" "No one's going to hire you, not after being publicly rejected like that." He said it harsh but honest. "Harlan's got friends, influence. He'll make sure of it." Fresh tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Then I'll move on. Another town, perhaps." "With what money, how far you think you'll get on foot with winter coming?" She had no answer to that. The sun had dropped lower, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. Soon it would be dark, and the temperature would plummet. Already, Ethan could see her shivering in her thin dress. He made a decision he knew he'd probably regret. "I've got a cabin on my ranch. It ain't much, but it's shelter. You can stay there tonight. Figure out what to do come morning." Her eyes widened. It wouldn't be proper." "Nothing about this situation is proper, Miss Dawson. But freezing to death or worse ain't a better option." She studied his face, searching for something kindness, cruelty, salvation, damnation. Whatever she found there made her nod slowly. "Just for tonight," she said firmly. "Just for tonight," he agreed, though something in his gut told him nothing would be that simple. He loaded her meager belongings, just the one carpet bag and a small trunk, into his wagon while she stood aside, arms wrapped around herself. The townspeople watched from windows and doorways, already spreading gossip like wildfire. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Ethan Carter had taken in Samuel Harlan's rejected mail-order bride. As they rode out of town, the setting sun at their backs. Margaret finally spoke. "Why did you help me?" Ethan kept his eyes on the rutted road ahead. "My ma came out here as a bride too. Not mail order, but might as well have been. Pa was rough around the edges, but he treated her decent. Gave her a chance." He paused, remembering his mother's gentle hands and tired eyes. "She died when I was 12. Pneumonia, but she lived those years as a respected woman, not as someone's embarrassment." Margaret absorbed this in silence. Then, "I'm not looking for charity." "Good, because I ain't got any to give. Ranch is barely holding together as it is. But you're welcome to the cabin for a spell while you sort yourself out." They rode the rest of the way in silence. The only sounds the creaking of the wagon and the distant howl of coyotes welcoming the night. Ethan's ranch came into view just as the last light faded a modest spread compared to some, with a main house that needed painting and fences that needed mending. But the small cabin set back from the main buildings looked solid enough. It had been his father's original homestead, built when he first claimed the land 20 years ago. One room with a stove, a narrow bed, and not much else. But it was clean and dry, and that was more than Margaret would have found in town. "It ain't much," Ethan said again as he lit a lantern and showed her inside. Margaret set down her bag and looked around with those intelligent green eyes. "It's perfect," she said simply. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." "Ethan," he corrected. "And like I said, just temporary." But as he walked back to the main house, leaving her to settle in, Ethan had the unsettling feeling that he just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The abandoned mail-order bride in his cabin, the weight of his father's legacy, the ranch teetering on the edge of ruin, it all pressed down on him like the gathering darkness. He paused at his door and looked back. Soft lamplight glowed from the cabin windows. For the first time in months, the old place looked alive, almost like home. "Just temporary," he repeated to himself, but the words rang hollow as a church bell in an empty town. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's single window, finding Margaret already awake and dressed. She'd barely slept, every creak of the old wood making her start, every coyote howl reminding her how far she'd fallen from her orderly life in Philadelphia. The narrow bed had been comfortable enough, but her mind wouldn't rest, replaying yesterday's humiliation and the uncertain path ahead. She stepped outside into the crisp morning air, her breath forming small clouds. The ranch spread before her in the early light, not grand, but honest. The main house stood about 50 yards away, smoke already rising from its chimney. Chickens pecked around a coop that had seen better days, and she could hear cattle lowing somewhere beyond the barn. "You're up early." Margaret jumped, her hand flying to her chest. Ethan stood near the well, apparently having just drawn water. His dark hair was damp, and he'd changed into work clothes that had been mended more than once. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to startle you," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. In daylight, without the tension of yesterday's confrontation, he seemed younger, less sure of himself. "I'm accustomed to early rising," Margaret replied, smoothing her skirts. "In Philadelphia, I had to be at the schoolhouse by 7. An awkward silence stretched between them. Then Ethan cleared his throat. "There's coffee on the stove in the main house, and biscuits from yesterday, if you're hungry." "I couldn't impose." "It ain't imposing to eat, Miss Dawson, and we need to talk about arrangements." The word hung heavy with implication. Margaret followed him to the main house, noting the way he walked slightly, favoring his left leg. Probably an old injury. The house itself was masculine in its sparseness, functional furniture. No curtains, dishes that didn't match, but it was clean, which surprised her. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, and the biscuits were indeed a day old. But Margaret ate gratefully. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite. "I can cook," she said suddenly, "and clean. I know you said this was temporary, but while I'm here, I could earn my keep." Ethan looked up from his own plate, those storm cloud eyes unreadable. "The cabin's yours as long as you need it. I ain't asking for anything in return." "And I'm not offering charity," Margaret shot back, surprising them both with her firmness. "I've never taken something for nothing in my life, and I don't intend to start now." A ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth. "You always this stubborn?" "When necessary." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Truth is, I could use the help. Been managing alone since Pa died, but..." He gestured vaguely at the house. And Margaret understood. The place functioned, but it lacked any touch of real care. "Then we have an agreement," she said. "Room and board in exchange for housekeeping and cooking. You know anything about ranch work, chickens, gardens, that sort of thing?" Margaret's cheeks colored slightly. "I'm a quick learner." This time his smile was real, brief but genuine. "I bet you are." They worked out the basics over breakfast. She'd handle the house, the chickens, and try to salvage what was left of the kitchen garden. He'd continue with the cattle and repairs. It was a business arrangement. Nothing more, they both assured themselves. But as Margaret tied an apron around her waist and surveyed the kitchen, she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. The first disaster came before noon. Ethan was fixing a fence post when he heard the commotion squawking chickens, a crash, and Margaret's very unladylike curse. He found her in the chicken coop, covered in feathers and feed, a basket of eggs overturned at her feet. "They attacked me," she gasped, pointing an accusing finger at a particularly smug-looking hen. Ethan tried to keep a straight face. Failed. The laughter that escaped him was rusty from disuse, but genuine. "It's not funny," Margaret protested, but her lips twitched. "That one?" She pointed again. "She's evil. I swear she aimed for my face." "That's Bessie. She's particular about strangers." He stepped into the coop, and the hens immediately calmed. "You got to move slow. Talk to them, like this." He demonstrated, his large hands gentle as he gathered eggs. Margaret watched, unconsciously leaning closer. He smelled of leather and coffee and something distinctly masculine. "Here," he said, placing a warm egg in her palm. "Try again." Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and both pulled back as if burned. But Margaret squared her shoulders and approached the hens again, this time mimicking his movements. When she successfully retrieved an egg without incident, her smile was bright enough to shame the sun. "I did it." "You did," he agreed, and something warm unfurled in his chest. The days fell into a rhythm. Margaret rose early to start breakfast. Ethan handled the morning chores, and they ate together before he headed out to work the ranch. She discovered a talent for bread making that surprised them both, and slowly the house began to show her influence curtains fashioned from old flour sacks, wild flowers in a cracked vase, the smell of real cooking instead of bachelor fare. But it wasn't easy. Margaret's hands, soft from years of holding nothing heavier than chalk, blistered and bled. Her back ached from scrubbing floors and hauling water. More than once. Ethan found her crying silently from sheer exhaustion, though she always pretended something was in her eye. "You don't have to work so hard," he told her one evening, watching her struggle with a bucket of water from the well. "Yes, I do," she replied fiercely. "I need to earn my place." "You've already earned it," he said quietly, taking the bucket from her. Their eyes met and held for a moment before both looked away. The first snowfall came early, a light dusting that turned the ranch into something from a fairy tale. Margaret stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching the flakes fall, when Ethan appeared with an armload of firewood. "Got to stock up," he explained, stacking the wood against her cabin wall. "Storms can come fast out here. You'll want to keep the stove going all night when it gets real cold." "In Philadelphia, we had coal furnaces," she said wistfully. "I never had to think about staying warm." "You missing it, Philadelphia?" She considered the question, I miss feeling like I belonged somewhere, like I had a purpose. You have a purpose here, he said, then seemed to catch himself. I mean, the work you're doing, it matters. Does it? She wrapped her shawl tighter. I'm just a temporary solution to a temporary problem. Something flashed in his eyes, frustration. Maybe, or something deeper. Nothing about you is temporary, Margaret. The words hung between them like the snowflakes, delicate and dangerous. Before either could respond, the dinner bell she'd installed rang from the main house, breaking the spell. But that night, the first real storm hit. Margaret woke to howling wind and the cabin shaking on its foundation. Snow driven sideways pelted the windows, and the temperature had dropped so dramatically that ice formed on the inside of the glass. She fed more wood into the stove, but it barely made a dent in the cold. A pounding on the door made her heart race. She opened it to find Ethan, covered in snow, his face grim. Pipes in the main house froze. Need to move you there for tonight. This cabin won't hold heat in a storm like this. She didn't argue, just grabbed her few belongings and followed him into the blizzard. The short walk felt like miles, wind cutting through her thin coat like knives. By the time they reached the main house, she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Here! Ethan threw more logs on the fire and pulled a chair close to the hearth. Sit, I'll make coffee. I should be the one. Sit, he commanded, and for once, she obeyed. He returned with coffee and a thick blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders with surprising gentleness. Should have moved you sooner. That cabin's not fit for winter, I just thought. He stopped, jaw tight. You thought I'd be gone by now, Margaret finished softly. He didn't deny it. They sat in silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The firelight danced across his features, softening the harsh lines worry had carved there. My father built that cabin when he first came here, Ethan said suddenly. Lived in it for 3 years while he saved enough to build this house. Met my mother at a barn raising. She took one look at that cabin and said she'd marry him when he had a proper house. A sad smile crossed his face. Took him 2 more years, but he did it. She sounds like a strong woman. She had to be, to survive out here. But it killed her in the end. The isolation, the work, the winters. He stared into the fire. Sometimes I wonder if Pa blamed himself. If that's why he pushed so hard. Worked himself into an early grave, trying to make this place into something more. Margaret reached out instinctively, her hand covering his on the arm of his chair. You can't blame yourself for their choices, or their fate. He looked at their joined hands, his calloused and scarred, hers small but no longer soft. Can't I? The storm raged for 2 days. 2 days of forced proximity, of learning each other's rhythms. Margaret discovered Ethan could play the fiddle, coaxing melancholy tunes from the instrument in the evening. He learned she could recite Shakespeare from memory and had a wicked sense of humor when she let her guard down. On the second night, as they sat by the fire playing cards, Margaret asked, Why haven't you married a ranch this size? You must have had opportunities. Ethan studied his cards intently. Never found anyone who wanted the life more than they wanted the idea of it. Ranch living sounds romantic until you're pulling calves at midnight in a snowstorm. And yet you stay. It's in my blood. This land. He struggled for words. It's harsh and unforgiving, but it's honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. Like you, Margaret said softly. He looked up sharply, but she was focused on her cards, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. When the storm finally broke, they emerged to a world transformed. Snow blanketed everything in pristine white, smoothing the rough edges of the ranch into something almost beautiful. But the temperature had plummeted, and Ethan knew the cabin would be uninhabitable until spring. You'll stay in the house, he announced, in a tone that brooked no argument. I'll move my things to the back room. It's proper enough with separate quarters. Margaret wanted to protest, but the memory of that bone-deep cold silenced her. "Just until spring," she agreed. "Just until spring," he echoed, though they both knew something fundamental had shifted during those storm-locked days. The careful distance they'd maintained had melted like snow in sunlight, leaving something tender and green beneath. As Margaret moved her few possessions into the small room off the kitchen, she found herself humming something she hadn't done since leaving Philadelphia. Through the window, she watched Ethan checking on the cattle, his figure dark against the white landscape. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd answered that advertisement. It was harder, lonelier, more uncertain, but standing in the warm kitchen of a house that was beginning to feel like home, watching a man who asked nothing of her but gave her shelter and respect, Margaret thought it might be something better. It might be real. The March thaw came slowly to Wyoming territory, revealing the ranch in all its winter-worn shabbiness. Melting snow exposed broken fence rails, damaged roofing, and the toll that months of harsh weather had taken on the land. But it also revealed something else. Tiny green shoots pushing through the mud. The promise of spring that even the hardest winter couldn't kill. Margaret knelt in what had once been a kitchen garden, her hands deep in the cold soil. She'd found seed packets in the cellar, carefully saved by someone Ethan's mother. She guessed and was determined to coax life from this patch of earth. "You're wasting your time," Ethan commented, passing by with a roll of wire for fence repairs. "That garden hasn't produced anything but weeds in years." "Then it's due for a change," Margaret replied without looking up. A strand of hair had escaped her bonnet, and she pushed it back with a muddy hand, leaving a smear across her cheek. Ethan found himself staring at that smudge of dirt, at the determined set of her jaw, the way the morning sun caught the red in her hair. 4 months. She'd been here 4 months, and somewhere along the way, he'd stopped thinking of her as a temporary guest. "Suit yourself," he muttered, moving on before she could see the softness in his eyes. The truth was, Margaret had transformed more than just the house. The chickens, once scrawny and barely producing, now laid regularly thanks to her careful tending. The kitchen had become a warm haven that smelled of bread and soup and comfort. Even the ranch hands who came by occasionally commented on the changes, though always carefully, aware of the delicate nature of the situation. But it was the smaller things that undid Ethan the way she hummed while she worked, how she'd learned to read his moods without words, the coffee that appeared at his elbow just when he needed it most. The ranch didn't feel like a burden when she was there. It felt like possibility. The calf came in the middle of a cold snap that reminded everyone winter wasn't quite finished. Ethan had been checking the pregnant cows regularly, but this one had hidden herself in a gulch, and by the time he found her, she was in trouble. Margaret heard him calling from the barn and ran out, not even stopping for a coat. She found him kneeling in the straw beside a laboring cow, his face grim. "Calf's turned wrong," he said without preamble. "I need to reposition it, but I need someone to hold her head." Margaret had never been this close to a birthing animal. The cow's eyes rolled with pain and fear, and every instinct told her to back away. Instead, she dropped to her knees beside the massive head. "What do I do?" "Talk to her. Keep her calm. Hold tight if she tries to get up." For the next hour, Margaret found herself in a world reduced to straw and sweat and whispered encouragement. She stroked the cow's neck, murmured soothing nonsense, and tried not to think about Ethan's increasingly frustrated curses. "Got it," he finally gasped. "Here she comes." The calf slid into the world in a rush of fluid and motion. For a terrifying moment, it lay still. Then Ethan cleared its airways, and it sucked in its first breath with a sound that made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. "You did good," Ethan said, and she realized he was looking at her, not the calf. His shirt was soaked with sweat and other things, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his smile was radiant. "Real good, Margaret." It was the first time in weeks he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his rough voice did something to her insides that had nothing to do with the miracle of birth. They stayed until the calf was nursing, until they were sure both mother and baby would survive. Walking back to the house in the pre-dawn darkness, Margaret stumbled on the uneven ground. Ethan caught her elbow, steadying her, and didn't let go. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I couldn't have done it alone." "We make a good team," she replied, then flushed at the implications. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Yeah, we do." Word spread, as word always did in small communities. The schoolmarm turned ranch woman who'd helped birth a calf in the middle of the night. Some sneered, saying it wasn't proper for an unmarried woman to be involved in such things. Others nodded approval if she was going to survive out here. She'd need to be tough. The first Sunday in April, Margaret surprised Ethan by announcing she wanted to go to church in town. "You sure that's wise?" he asked carefully. They'd avoided town for months, getting supplies through the ranch hands or doing without. "I can't hide forever," she said, chin lifted in that way he'd come to recognize meant her mind was made up. "Besides, it's Easter." So they went. Ethan in his one good suit that smelled of cedar and camphor. Margaret in a dress she'd remade from one of his mother's. The church was small, whitewashed, and filled with curious eyes that tracked their every movement. Reverend Mills, at least, was welcoming. But Margaret felt the weight of whispers, saw the way some women pulled their children closer when she passed. She kept her head high through the service, through the hymns, through the sermon about redemption and new life. It was afterward that Samuel Harland approached. He looked rougher than she remembered, his clothes showing the neglect of a man living alone, a half-healed cut on his jaw suggesting he'd been fighting. "Well, well," he drawled, blocking their path to the wagon. "The happy couple." "Harland." Ethan's voice carried warning. "Heard you took her in. Carter. Heard she's keeping your house now." Samuel's bloodshot eyes raked over Margaret in a way that made her skin crawl. "Guess one man's trash really is another man's treasure. Watch your mouth." Ethan stepped forward, but Margaret caught his arm. "Mr. Harland," she said calmly, though her heart raced. "I pray you found peace since our last meeting." Samuel's face darkened. "Don't you preach at me, woman. You lied." "I told the truth. Every word in those letters was mine. If you expected something different, perhaps you should examine your own assumptions rather than blaming others for your disappointment." A crowd was gathering, just as before, but this time, Margaret felt Ethan solid beside her, felt her own spine straight with earned pride. "You always did like damaged goods, Carter." Samuel snarled. "Just like your PA, took in every stray that wandered by, never could turn away from a lost cause." "My father was a good man," Ethan said quietly. "He taught me the value of hard work and human decency, things you might benefit from learning." Samuel took a swing. It was clumsy, telegraphed by alcohol and anger. Ethan sidestepped easily, and Samuel's momentum carried him face first into the mud. "Come on," Ethan said, guiding Margaret to the wagon while Samuel struggled to his feet, cursing. "He's not worth it." As they drove away, Margaret noticed something. Not everyone had been hostile. Mrs. Patterson had nodded to her. Doc Whelan had touched his hat. Small gestures, but in a small town, they mattered. "You handled that well," Ethan said once they'd cleared town. "I'm tired of being ashamed," Margaret replied. "I did nothing wrong except trust the wrong man. And if that's my greatest sin, I can live with it." He glanced at her bonnet slightly askew, color high in her cheeks, jaw set with determination. "You're something else. Margaret Dawson." "Is that good or bad?" "Good," he said without hesitation. "Definitely good." They rode in comfortable silence until the ranch came into view. Home, Margaret thought, then caught herself. When had she started thinking of it as home? That evening, as they did the chores together, a routine now as natural as breathing the calf they delivered came to the fence. It was thriving. all knobby knees and curious eyes. "She needs a name," Ethan said. "Hope," Margaret suggested without thinking. "She should be called Hope." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and the air smelled of growing things and possibility. "Hope it is," he agreed. Later, as Margaret prepared supper and Ethan mended tack by the fire, she found herself humming again. The house felt full in a way it hadn't in months, maybe years. Not just with the smell of stew and the crackle of fire, but with something harder to name: partnership, purpose. The ghost of Ethan's father seemed less heavy in these rooms now. The sorrow that had clung to the walls like smoke was dissipating, replaced by something that felt suspiciously like joy. "Margaret," Ethan said suddenly, not looking up from his work. "I've been thinking about the ranch, about things." She paused in her stirring, heart suddenly racing. "Oh, that old cabin, come summer, I could fix it up proper, make it into something permanent, if someone wanted to stay." The offer hung between them, delicate as spun glass. Not a declaration, not yet, but an opening, a possibility. "That's a lot of work," she said carefully. "For something temporary." He finally looked up, and their eyes met across the homey kitchen. "Maybe it doesn't have to be temporary." Margaret turned back to the stove to hide her smile. "Maybe not," she agreed. Outside, Hope the calf called for her mother, and was answered. The sound carried on the evening air like a promise, like spring itself inevitable, renewing and worth every moment of winter endured to reach it. The heat of late June pressed down on the ranch like a heavy hand, turning the grass golden and the creek to a trickle. Margaret worked in the garden, now flourishing despite Ethan's early predictions, when she heard the approaching horses, 3 riders, moving with the purposeful pace of men on business. She recognized Samuel Harland immediately. The months hadn't been kind to him. His face showed the ravages of drink and bitterness. With him rode 2 men she didn't know, hard-faced strangers with guns worn low on their hips. Margaret's hand went instinctively to the rifle Ethan had taught her to use, propped against the garden fence, but before she could reach it, the men were upon her. "Well, Mrs. Carter," Samuel drawled, using the title mockingly, though no marriage had taken place. "Ain't you looking domestic?" "Mr. Harland." She kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered. "Ethan isn't here. You'll need to come back another time." "Oh, I think now suits just fine." He swung down from his horse, his companions following. "See, I've been doing some thinking, and some checking with the territorial office." Margaret's blood chilled. She knew what was coming before he said it. "Funny thing about mail-order marriages," Samuel continued, pulling a folded paper from his vest. "They got to be registered proper, and according to this here document, you and I got ourselves a binding contract, one you never dissolved legal-like before taking up with Carter." "That contract was voided when you rejected me publicly," Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice level. "You made your choice clear. Did I put it in writing? Did I file papers?" His smile was cruel. "No, I just had a moment of disappointment, but I'm willing to overlook your little indiscretion here. Come back where you belong, and we'll say no more about it." "I belong here," Margaret said firmly. "Do you now?" One of the strangers spoke for the first time. "Because the way I hear it, Mr. Harland here has legal claim, and he's willing to pursue it through the courts. Could get messy, especially for Carter." The threat was clear. Ethan's ranch, already struggling, couldn't survive a legal battle, and Samuel had connections, influence that could turn the law to his advantage. "What do you really want?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew. Samuel's eyes glittered with malice. "Carter's been a thorn in my side for years. Him and his high-minded father, acting like they're better than everyone. Time someone took them down a notch." He paused. letting the words sink in. "But I'm a reasonable man. You come with me now, quiet-like, and I'll leave Carter be, fight me, and I'll ruin him, take his land, his cattle, everything. All legal and proper." Margaret's mind raced. She could see it playing out the court battle, the expense, the way Samuel would twist the truth. Ethan would fight for her. She knew that, and it would destroy him. "I need time to gather my things," she said quietly. Samuel's grin widened. "Now you're being sensible, boys. Help the lady pack." What followed was a nightmare of rough hands pawing through her few possessions. Lewd comments about what Samuel would do with his property once he had her home. Margaret endured it all with silent dignity, her mind working furiously. As they prepared to leave, she made one request: "Let me leave a note, so he knows I went willingly." Samuel laughed. "Sure. Let him know you chose proper society over his dirt farm. Might learn him some humility." Margaret wrote quickly, aware of Samuel reading over her shoulder. *Ethan, I have chosen to honor my original commitment. Please do not follow or interfere. What we shared was a beautiful dream, but dreams must end. Take care of Hope. M***. She left it on the kitchen table, weighted down with the small wooden box where she kept her mother's ring, the only valuable thing she owned. Let him understand. Let him see past the words to what she couldn't say. As they rode away, Margaret didn't look back at the ranch that had become her home, but she memorized the smell of the sage, the feel of the sun, the distant bellow of cattle. She would need these memories for what was coming. Samuel's place was everything she'd feared, a rundown spread that spoke of neglect and poor management. The house smelled of whiskey and unwashed clothes. The yard was bare dirt, scattered with broken equipment. "Home, sweet home," Samuel sneered, shoving her through the door. "You'll have this place cleaned up quick enough. That's what women are for, ain't it?" The two strangers had stayed outside, but their presence was felt guards to ensure she didn't run. Margaret stood in the filthy kitchen, fighting down despair. She'd sacrificed her happiness for Ethan's safety. Now she had to survive long enough for him to understand, to move on, to forget her. But Ethan Carter wasn't a man who forgot easily. He'd found the note when he returned from moving cattle to higher pasture, read it once, twice, then crumpled it in his fist. The wooden box caught his eye, and he opened it to find not just her mother's ring, but a pressed wildflower, the first one to bloom in her garden. "Oh, like hell," he muttered. Within an hour, he was riding hard for town, straight to Doc Whelan's office. The old man was more than a doctor. He was educated, respected, and most importantly, he knew the law. "She's trying to protect you," Doc said after hearing the story. "Harlan's been spreading word about that contract. Says he's got a judge in Cheyenne who'll uphold it." "Is it legal?" Doc polished his spectacles thoughtfully. "Contracts for mail-order marriages are tricky business. Consideration was given, she traveled on his promise. But his public rejection," he shrugged, "could go either way in court. Depends on the judge." "Then we need a better argument," Ethan said grimly. Meanwhile, at Samuel's ranch, Margaret was learning just how deep his bitterness ran. He didn't want a wife, he wanted a servant, someone to punish for all his failures. She cooked, she cleaned. She endured his drunken ravings about how the Carters had poisoned the town against him, stolen his rightful place. "Your precious Ethan won't come," he told her on the third night, breath sour with whiskey. "He's too smart for that. Knows I'd ruin him." His hand reached for her, and she stepped back, holding a cast-iron pan between them. "Touch me and I'll brain you with this," she said calmly. He laughed, but there was uncertainty in it. "You've gotten uppity, woman. But we'll fix that. We'll be properly married tomorrow. Judge Hackett's coming special from Cheyenne." Margaret's heart sank. Once married, her legal options would vanish entirely. She'd be trapped, properly and permanently. That night, As Samuel snored off his drunk and his guards played cards on the porch, Margaret crept to the kitchen window. Hope seemed impossible, but she whispered a prayer anyway, watching the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that shone on Ethan's ranch. As if in answer, she heard the distant sound of horses, many horses, moving fast through the darkness. Ethan had spent 3 days gathering allies, not gunmen, but something more powerful, witnesses. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, who'd seen Samuel's public rejection, the stage driver who'd heard every word, even Reverend Mills, who'd counseled that contracts made in deception were void in the eyes of God and man. But it was the fourth rider who mattered most, Judge Theodore Morrison, Doc Whelan's brother-in-law, who happened to be visiting from Denver. A real judge, with real authority, not the corrupt puppet Samuel had summoned. They arrived as dawn broke, finding Samuel stumbling onto his porch with a shotgun. "Get off my land, Carter!" "Can't do that," Ethan replied calmly. "We're here on legal business. Judge Morrison has some questions about a contract." Samuel's face went white as he recognized the judge. "You can't, Hackett's coming." "Judge Hackett's been relieved of his duties," Morrison said sternly. "Seems there were irregularities in several of his recent rulings. Now, about this marriage contract." What followed was swift and decisive, with the witnesses testifying to Samuel's public rejection, with Margaret's own account of being brought by force and threats. The judge ruled the contract null and void. Furthermore, Morrison added, "Kidnapping is a serious charge in the territory, as is extortion." Samuel tried to run. He made it 3 steps before Ethan's fist connected with his jaw, dropping him like a sack of grain. It was the only violence needed. Samuel's hired guards, seeing which way the wind blew, suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Margaret stood on the porch, hardly daring to believe it was over. Then Ethan was there, pulling her into his arms, and she was crying into his shirt, all the fear and desperation of the past days pouring out. "Did you really think I'd let you go?" he murmured into her hair. "Did you really think I'd choose the ranch over you?" "I couldn't let him destroy everything you'd built." "You are everything I've built," he said fiercely. "The ranch is just land and cattle, but you're home. Margaret, you're my home." She pulled back to see his face, saw the truth of it in his storm cloud eyes. "Ethan?" "Marry me," he said suddenly. "Right now. Judge Morrison can do it. Make it legal and proper and permanent. Be my wife, Margaret. Not because you need protection, not because of contracts or obligations. Because I love you. Because I can't imagine waking up another day without you there." Margaret thought of all the reasons she'd come west to escape. Hope, the promise of a new life. She'd found all that and more in a rundown ranch and a taciturn man who'd shown her kindness when the world had been cruel. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ethan, always yes." They were married there on Samuel's porch, of all places, with the sunrise painting the sky gold and rose. Mrs. Patterson wept openly. The stage driver grinned like he'd personally arranged it all, and Doc Whelan served as witness with obvious satisfaction. Samuel, nursing a broken jaw and facing charges, was hauled away to jail. His ranch would be sold for debts. The judge mentioned casually perhaps Ethan might be interested in expanding his holdings. But all that was for later. For now, there was just the ride home, truly home, with Margaret tucked against Ethan's side, his arms secure around her, her mother's ring finally on her finger where it belonged. "I love you," she said as their ranch came into view. "I think I have since that first morning, when you taught me about the chickens." He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "I love you too. Though I think for me it was when you delivered hope, watching you fight for that new life. I knew then you belonged here. Belonged with me." They rode through their gate, and Margaret saw her garden blooming wild with summer flowers. Saw Hope grazing with her mother. Saw the cabin that would indeed be fixed up proper. though not for the reason Ethan had first suggested. "Welcome home, Mrs. Carter," Ethan said, helping her down from the horse. "I've been home for months," she replied, stretching up to kiss him as the morning sun blessed their beginning. "I just needed the world to catch up." The storm rolled in just after sunset, turning the sky an ominous green-black that made the cattle restless and sent the chickens scurrying for cover. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching lightning fork across the horizon while thunder rumbled like distant cannon fire. "It's going to be a bad one," Ethan said, coming in from securing the barn. Water dripped from his hat, and his clothes were already soaked through. "Haven't seen clouds like that since the year Pa lost half his herd." They'd been married just 2 weeks, the golden days passing in a blur of shared work and quiet evenings by the fire. The legal transfer of Samuel's confiscated land had given them hope for the ranch's future, but tonight, nature seemed determined to remind them who truly ruled the frontier. The first real crack of thunder shook the house, and rain began falling in sheets so thick they couldn't see the barn. Then came the sound they'd both been dreading: hail, starting as small pellets but quickly growing to the size of river stones. "The garden," Margaret breathed, thinking of her carefully tended vegetables, the corn just beginning to tassel, the tomatoes finally ripening. "Let it go." Ethan caught her arm as she moved toward the door. "It's not worth risking." Another sound cut through the storm's fury, the terrified bellowing of cattle and the ominous crack of breaking wood. "The fence," Ethan swore. "If they stampede in this—" He was already reaching for his rain slicker. "You can't go out in this," Margaret protested. "The lightning—" "If we lose the herd, we lose everything." His face was grim. "Stay inside. No matter what you hear, stay inside." But Margaret had never been good at following orders that didn't make sense. As soon as Ethan disappeared into the storm, she pulled on his old work coat and followed. The world outside was chaos. Rain hit like bullets. Hail bounced off the ground with vicious force, and the wind tried to tear her off her feet. Lightning turned everything stark white for seconds at a time, revealing glimpses of disaster. The garden flattened, fences down, cattle milling in panic. She found Ethan trying to turn the lid steers, his horse dancing nervously as he worked to prevent a full stampede. Even in the storm's fury, Margaret could see it was a losing battle. The cattle were too frightened, the noise too overwhelming. Then she remembered a trick her grandfather had used with his dairy cows during thunderstorms. Racing back to the house, she grabbed the old dinner bell and a pot from the kitchen. Back in the storm, she began ringing the bell in a steady rhythm, banging the pot in counterpoint. It shouldn't have worked, but something about the familiar sound, the same bell that called them for feeding, cut through the storm's terror. The lead steer turned his massive head toward her, confused but no longer running blind. "Keep ringing!" Ethan shouted over the wind, working together, with Margaret maintaining the rhythm and Ethan guiding. They slowly turned the herd back toward the barn shelter. They were perhaps 50 yards from safety when lightning struck the old cottonwood near the creek. The explosion of sound and light sent the cattle into fresh panic, and in the chaos, Margaret saw Ethan's horse rear and fall. She dropped the bell and ran, slipping in the mud, hail bruising her shoulders and back. She found him trapped beneath his horse, conscious but grimacing in pain. "My leg," he gritted out. "Think it's broken." The horse struggled to rise, hooves dangerously close to Ethan's head. Margaret grabbed the reins, speaking in the soothing tone she'd learned, coaxing the terrified animal up and away. Then she was beside Ethan, rain streaming down her face as she assessed the damage. "Can you move?" Not without help. The storm showed no signs of lessening. Lightning struck again, closer this time, and Margaret made a decision. She couldn't lift him alone, but she could drag him, using techniques she'd never known she possessed. She got him sitting up, then pulled his arm over her shoulders. "On 3, she said. 1, 2. Together they struggled upright, Ethan bearing what weight he could on his good leg, Every step was agony for him. She could tell, but he didn't complain. Inch by inch, they fought their way through the mud and rain toward the house. They'd made it halfway when Margaret's strength began to fail. Her legs shook, her back screamed, and the weight of him seemed to double with each step. Then, miraculously, help arrived. Tom Bradley and his son Jake, their nearest neighbors, appearing out of the storm like angels. "Saw the lightning strike," Tom shouted. "Figured you might need help." With 4 of them, they got Ethan inside. Margaret barely remembered the next hour sending Jake for Doc Whelan, helping strip Ethan's wet clothes, stoking the fire until the kitchen felt like summer. She moved on instinct and adrenaline, refusing to let herself think about how still he'd gone, how pale his face was beneath the mud. Doc Whelan arrived as the storm finally began to ease. His medical bag clutched against his chest. His examination was thorough but reassuring. "Clean break," he announced. "Painful, but it'll heal straight if you follow orders." He looked sternly at Ethan. "That means staying off it for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks? Ethan struggled to sit up. "Doc, I can't. The ranch." "The ranch will survive," Margaret said firmly, pushing him back down. "We'll manage." After Doc left, having set the leg and provided laudanum for the pain, Margaret finally allowed herself to collapse in the chair beside their bed. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by water dripping from the eaves. "You should have stayed inside," Ethan said, his voice slightly slurred from the medicine. "And let you die out there." She took his hand, feeling the calluses and strength even now. "We're partners. Remember, for better or worse." "This is definitely worse." He tried to joke, then sobered. "The garden will grow again. The fences can be repaired. The cattle are safe." She squeezed his hand. "You're alive. That's all that matters." He studied her face in the lamplight, the mud still streaking her cheeks, her hair a wild tangle, her dress ruined beyond repair. "You saved my life." "You saved mine first," she reminded him. "That day at the stage depot, we're even." "No," he said softly. "Not even close. I gave you shelter. You gave me a reason to want it." The next days revealed the storm's full damage. Half the garden was destroyed, several sections of fence needed complete rebuilding, and they'd lost a dozen chickens to hail. But as neighbors arrived to help Tom Bradley and his sons, the Millers from the neighboring spread, even Mrs. Patterson from town with a basket of preserves, Margaret understood something fundamental about frontier life. "We take care of our own." "Mrs." Patterson said simply, setting Margaret to rights when she tried to thank her. "You're one of us now." With Ethan confined to bed, Margaret found herself thrust into roles she'd never imagined. Tom Bradley taught her to mend fences, his patient instruction peppered with approval at her quick learning. Young Jake showed her how to doctor injured cattle, a skill that turned her stomach at first but soon became second nature. "You're a natural," Tom told her one afternoon, watching her successfully treat a cow's infected hoof. "Got the touch for it." "I had a good teacher," she replied, thinking of Ethan's gentle hands with the animals, his quiet way of moving that calmed even the most skittish beast. Evenings were for planning. Ethan, propped up in bed with pillows, would sketch out what needed doing while Margaret took notes. They pored over the ranch's books together, her education proving invaluable as she helped him figure ways to economize without sacrificing the herd's health. "We could sell the timber rights to the north section," she suggested one night. "It's too rocky for grazing anyway." "That's Carter land," Ethan protested. "Been in the family since your father claimed it." "I know." She softened her voice. "But would he rather you keep every acre or keep the ranch itself?" It was during these quiet evenings, the lamp casting a golden circle around them while they planned and dreamed, that their marriage deepened from attraction into true partnership. Margaret learned Ethan's moods, when to push and when to let him stew, how to make him laugh when the confinement grew unbearable. He learned her strengths, not just the obvious ones of cooking and housekeeping, but her head for figures, her innovative solutions, her absolutely unbendable will when she knew she was right. "I never expected this," he confessed one night, after she'd successfully negotiated a better price for their cattle with a buyer from Cheyenne. "A wife who could haggle," she teased. "A wife who could do everything." His expression grew serious. Pa always protected Ma, kept her separate from the harsh realities. "I thought that was love. But this working beside you, even when I'm stuck in this bed, this feels like something more." "It is more," Margaret said simply. "It's partnership. It's building something together that neither of us could manage alone." The night Ethan finally stood on his newly healed leg, Margaret caught him staring out the window at the ranch, their ranch spread out in the moonlight. The storm damage had been repaired, the garden replanted, the fences stronger than before. "What are you thinking?" she asked, sliding her arms around his waist from behind. "That we survived." He turned in her embrace, looking down at her with those storm cloud eyes that now held depths of warmth she'd helped put there. "The worst nature could throw at us, and we survived." "Together," she corrected. "Together," he agreed, and kissed her as lightning flickered on the horizon, distant now. No longer a threat, but a reminder of what they could weather. Later, as they prepared for bed in the quiet house that had become a true home, Margaret remembered her fear during the storm, not of the lightning or the hail, but of losing him. She'd come west seeking security and found something infinitely more precious, a love that could survive any storm, a partnership that made them both stronger than they'd ever been alone. "No regrets?" Ethan asked, watching her brush out her hair by lamplight. "Only one," she said seriously, then smiled at his worried expression. "I wish I'd knocked on your door the day I arrived instead of wasting time with Samuel Harland." His laughter filled the room, rich and genuine. "Then we'd have missed all the drama." "I could have lived without the drama," she said dryly, "but not without this, not without you." Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, not a storm this time, but the kind of steady precipitation that would nourish the replanted garden and refill the creek. Margaret listened to it patter against the windows and felt nothing but gratitude. Let the storms come. She and Ethan would weather them all, together. The dust cloud on the horizon meant trouble. Ethan had been watching it grow for the past hour, and the way it moved fast and purposeful told him this wasn't casual travelers or a cattle drive. He checked the rifle propped against the fence post, then called to Margaret, who was hanging laundry in the yard. "Get inside. Take the shotgun from above the mantel." She didn't question him, just gathered her skirts and moved quickly toward the house. 6 months of marriage had taught her to read his moods, and the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. The riders came into view as the sun reached its peak, 8 men, led by someone Ethan had hoped never to see again. Samuel Harland looked worse than when they'd last met, his time in jail having added a dangerous edge to his bitterness. But it was the man riding beside him that made Ethan's blood run cold. Jack Thornton, a hired gun known throughout the territory for his willingness to do anything for the right price. They stopped just outside the property line, a deliberate insult that said they knew exactly where Ethan's land began. "Carter," Samuel called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "We need to talk." "Nothing to talk about. Harland, you're not welcome here." Samuel smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "See, that's where you're wrong. I've been doing some thinking during my involuntary vacation about property rights, about justice." Thornton shifted in his saddle, his hand resting casually near his pistol. The other men spread out slightly, a move so practiced it seemed almost lazy. But Ethan recognized the tactics. They were cutting off angles of escape, preparing for violence. "Whatever you're planning, it won't work," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. "The law." "The law," Samuel laughed bitterly. "The law took everything from me. My land, my reputation, my future. All because of your woman and her lies.
The only liar here is you.
Margaret's voice came from behind Ethan. She stood in the doorway, the shotgun held with surprising competence. You made your choices. Samuel, now live with them. Thornton's eyes flicked to her, assessing. Brave little thing. Ain't she be ashamed if something happened to her? The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Ethan's hand moved toward his rifle, but Thornton was faster, his pistol clearing leather in a motion smooth as water. Now, Samuel said, fake reasonable. No need for unpleasantness. Not yet. We're here to make you an offer. Carter, a fair one. I'm listening, Ethan said, though every instinct screamed danger. Sell me your ranch. I'll pay. Samuel pretended to consider. Let's say half what it's worth. You and your bride can take the money and start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere far from here. Not interested. You sure about that? Thornton spoke up, his voice soft with menace. Man's got to think about his family. Accidents happen on ranches. Fires start. Cattle disappear. Pretty wives find themselves alone on long rides to town. Margaret stepped fully outside, moving to stand beside Ethan. Are you threatening us? Threatening. Samuel's eyes widened in mock innocence. We're just having a friendly conversation about possibilities, about what might happen if folks don't see reason. Get off our land, Margaret said firmly. Now. Samuel's face darkened. Our land. This was supposed to be mine. All of it. My father had a deal with old man Carter. No deal was ever signed. Ethan cut him off. Your father tried to cheat mine, and when that didn't work, he spent the rest of his life poisoning you with lies. The words hit home. Samuel's hand dropped to his gun, but Thornton stopped him with a gesture. 3 days, the hired gun said calmly. You've got 3 days to reconsider. After that, he shrugged eloquently. They wheeled their horses and rode away, leaving dust and dread in their wake. Ethan waited until they were out of sight before allowing his shoulders to slump. We need help, Margaret said quietly. Tom Bradley's solid, but he's got his own family to protect. The Millers are too far away. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. And the sheriff's in Harlan's pocket. Then we defend ourselves. He looked at her, this woman who'd been teaching school children just a year ago, now talking about defending their home against hired killers. Margaret, no, her green eyes flashed with determination. We've built something here. Ethan, something worth protecting. I won't let them take it. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Ethan reinforced the shutters, checked their ammunition, filled every container with water in case of fire. Margaret cooked enough food to last several days and moved their valuables to the root cellar. As night fell, they settled in to wait. The first night passed quietly. So did the second. By the third day, nerves were strung tight as fence wire. Every sound made them jump. Every dust cloud sent them reaching for weapons. Maybe they were just trying to scare us, Margaret suggested as they ate a tense supper. Maybe, Ethan agreed, though he didn't believe it. The attack came at midnight. Margaret woke to the smell of smoke and Ethan shaking her shoulder. The barn, he said urgently. They fired the barn. Through the window, orange flames licked at the sky. The horses were screaming, the cattle bellowing in panic. Without thinking, Margaret grabbed a bucket and ran for the door, but Ethan caught her arm. That's what they want. Draw us out. Pick us off.
The animals.
I know. His face was grim. Stay here. Guard the house.
Ethan, no.
But he was already gone, rifle in hand, disappearing into the flickering darkness. Margaret stationed herself at the window, shotgun ready, scanning for movement. She saw Ethan reach the barn, saw him fighting to release the terrified horses. Then she saw something else, a figure creeping along the side of the house. Without hesitation, she fired through the window. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. and the figure yelped and scrambled away. Another shape moved near the chicken coop. She fired again, pumping the shotgun with hands that barely trembled. "Little witch has teeth," someone shouted. "Thornton," she thought. The battle that followed was chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Margaret lost track of Ethan in the smoke and confusion, could only fire at shadows and pray. The barn was fully engulfed now, casting wild shadows that made every movement suspect. Then she heard Ethan's voice, raised in pain. Without thought, she abandoned her post and ran toward the sound. She found him behind the water trough, clutching his shoulder where blood seeped between his fingers. "Get back to the house," he gritted out. "Not without you." She helped him to his feet, half dragging him towards safety. They'd made it halfway when Thornton stepped out of the smoke, gun leveled. Well, the happy couple. His smile was cold as winter wind. "Harland wants you alive. Carter, but he didn't say anything about your wife." Time seemed to slow. Margaret saw Thornton's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Ethan trying to push her behind him despite his wound. Then, impossibly, Thornton jerked and fell forward, a knife protruding from his back. Tom Bradley emerged from the smoke, his son Jake and several other neighbors behind him, all armed. "Sorry we're late," Tom said calmly. "Took a while to gather everyone." The tide turned quickly after that, outnumbered now and with their leader down. Samuel's hired men scattered. Samuel himself tried to run but didn't get far. Jake Bradley's lasso brought him down hard. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins of the barn, the cost became clear. Half their winter hay was gone, the barn itself a total loss. But the house stood intact. The animals had survived, and most importantly, they were alive. Sheriff Watson arrived with the sunrise, conveniently after the fighting was done. But with Tom Bradley and the others as witnesses and Thornton's body as evidence, even he couldn't ignore what had happened. "Attempted murder, arson, conspiracy," the sheriff listed reluctantly. "You're looking at serious time. Harland." Samuel, his face twisted with impotent rage, spat in the dirt. "This ain't over." "Yes, it is," Margaret said quietly. She stood beside Ethan, his blood still on her hands, soot in her hair, but unbroken. "It's over because we're not afraid of you anymore. This is our home, our land, our life, and we'll defend it against anyone who tries to take it." As they watched the sheriff lead Samuel away, Ethan pulled Margaret close with his good arm. "You all right?" She considered the question. She'd shot at men, seen violence up close, watched their barn burn. The woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach would have been horrified, but that woman was gone, transformed by love and hardship into someone stronger. "I'm all right," she said, and meant it. Tom Bradley approached, hat in hand. "We'll help rebuild the barn. Community effort. Can't have the newest misses. Carter thinking we don't take care of our own." "I don't know what to say," Margaret began, but Tom waved her off. "Nothing to say. You'd do the same for us?" He paused, then added with a grin. "Though next time you might wait for backup before taking on hired guns single-handed." As the neighbors organized the cleanup and Doc Whelan tended Ethan's shoulder just a graze, thankfully Margaret found herself standing where the barn door had been. Hope, the calf she'd helped deliver, now grown into a young cow, nuzzled her hand. "We survived," she murmured, scratching behind Hope's ears. "Again." Ethan joined her, his arm in a sling but his eyes warm. "Starting to be a habit with us?" "Good thing we're stubborn." "Good thing," he agreed, then grew serious. "Margaret, what you did tonight." "What we did," she corrected. "Partners. Remember?" He kissed her then, right there in front of everyone, not caring who saw. When they broke apart, Margaret saw approval in the faces around them. She'd earned her place here not through marriage alone, but through courage, through standing and fighting when it mattered. Let's build it better this time, Ethan said, gesturing at the barn's remains. Bigger, stronger. Stone foundation, Margaret suggested. Harder to burn. Stone foundation, he agreed, for everything. As the sun climbed higher, neighbors arrived with tools and supplies, ready to help rebuild what violence had tried to destroy. Margaret worked alongside them, no longer the abandoned mail-order bride, no longer the outsider. She was Margaret Carter, rancher's wife, defender of her home, partner in every sense of the word. And as she watched Ethan directing the work despite his injury, saw the respect in the eyes of their neighbors, felt the solid ground beneath her feet, she knew they'd won more than just a fight. They'd won their right to this life, this land, this love that had grown from the ashes of abandonment into something unshakable. No regrets, Ethan asked that night as they sat on the porch, watching the stars appear. Margaret thought of Philadelphia, of the safe, predictable life she'd left behind. Then she looked at her husband, at their land, at the future they were building with their own hands. Not a single one, she said, and meant every word. The new barn stood proud against the September sky, its stone foundation solid as the mountains themselves. The whole community had pitched in to rebuild it, and the result was better than anything the Carter Ranch had seen before. Margaret stood in its doorway, watching the children from town explore the hayloft under their parents' watchful eyes. The barn raising had become a celebration, with tables groaning under the weight of food, fiddle music floating on the autumn air, and laughter replacing the gunshots that had echoed here just months before. Mama Margaret, little Sarah Bradley ran up, her face flushed with excitement. Can you show us the baby calf again? The title made Margaret's heart swell. Somewhere along the way, she'd become Mama Margaret to half the children in the valley, the woman who could calm a colicky baby, who always had fresh cookies, who told stories about faraway Philadelphia that made their eyes go wide with wonder. Of course, sweetheart, she said, taking the girl's hand. But we must be gentle. She's only a week old. As she led a group of children to see the new calf, Margaret caught Ethan watching her from across the yard. His expression held something she'd been seeing more often lately, a soft wonder mixed with a question he hadn't yet voiced. She knew what he was thinking. The same thought had been growing in her own heart as she watched him with the Bradley boys, teaching them to rope with endless patience. After showing the children the calf and returning them to their parents, Margaret found herself in the kitchen with Mrs. Patterson and several other women from town. The conversation flowed around quilting patterns and preserving techniques until Mrs. Miller mentioned her daughter's upcoming wedding. "Third one this year," she said with satisfaction. "Seems like everyone's settling down now that the territory's becoming more civilized." Speaking of which, Mrs. Patterson turned to Margaret with knowing eyes. "When might we expect an announcement from the Carter household?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "We've been rather busy with the ranch. Been married near on 8 months now," old Mrs. Henderson observed, her eyes twinkling. "Usually by this time." The unfinished sentence hung in the air. Margaret's hands went unconsciously to her flat stomach, and she found herself fighting unexpected tears. The truth was, she'd begun to wonder herself. Each month brought hope, then disappointment. She'd said nothing to Ethan, not wanting to burden him with her fears. "Now, ladies," Mrs. Patterson said firmly, seeing Margaret's distress. "These things happen in God's time, not ours." She patted Margaret's shoulder. "Besides, this one's got plenty of children to mother already, what with half the valley calling her Mama Margaret." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but Margaret remained quiet, her thoughts turning inward. That night, after the last wagon had rolled away and the ranch had settled into peaceful darkness, she found herself unable to sleep. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Ethan, and made her way to the porch. The night was clear. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. She'd been sitting there only a few minutes when the door opened behind her. "Can't sleep?" Ethan asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders before settling beside her. "Just thinking." "About what Mrs. Henderson said." She looked at him in surprise. "You heard?" "Sound carries." He was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, if it doesn't happen for us children, I mean you need to know that you're enough, more than enough. You've already given me more than I ever dreamed of having." The tears she'd been holding back all evening finally spilled over. "I want to give you sons to carry on the ranch, daughters to fill this house with laughter." "This house is already full," he said softly, pulling her against his side. "Full of love, full of life, full of you. That's all I need." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Then Margaret remembered something. "I have something for you," she said, disappearing inside briefly before returning with a leather-bound journal. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside, in her neat schoolteacher's handwriting, was the story of their first year together. Every milestone, every small triumph, every challenge overcome. She'd pressed flowers from her garden between the pages, sketched the view from their porch, even included a recipe for the bread that had finally turned out perfect. "You said once that I should write my own story," she explained as he turned the pages with careful hands. "So I did. Our story." Ethan's voice was rough when he finally spoke. "It's perfect, but it's not finished." "No," she agreed. "Not nearly." 2 weeks later, their peaceful routine was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. The boy who rode up to their gate couldn't have been more than 16, dusty and trail-worn, leading a pack horse laden with supplies. "Looking for the Carter place," he called out. "You found it," Ethan replied, walking out to meet him. "What's your business?" The boy dismounted, pulling off his hat to reveal a shock of red hair and green eyes that seemed familiar. "Name's Patrick Dawson. I'm looking for my sister, Margaret Dawson. Heard she might have come this way." Margaret, who'd been feeding the chickens, dropped the bucket. "Patrick?" The boy's face lit up. "Maggie, is that really you?" The reunion was tearful and confused in equal measure. Patrick had been barely 10 when Margaret left Philadelphia, placed with a different family after their parents' death. She'd lost track of him in the chaos of her sister's illness and her own desperate circumstances. "But how did you find me?" she asked. Once they were all seated in the kitchen with coffee and the inevitable plate of cookies. "Took some doing," Patrick admitted. "But I remembered you talking about going west, maybe as a mail-order bride, when I aged out of the orphanage. I started asking around. Fellow in Cheyenne said he'd heard about some excitement with a bride in Cedar Ridge. Thought it was worth checking." Margaret studied her little brother, now grown tall and lean. "What are your plans?" Patrick shifted uncomfortably. "I was hoping... Well, I'm a hard worker, good with horses. Thought maybe I could hire on somewhere. Stay close by." Ethan and Margaret exchanged glances. The ranch could use another hand, especially with their expanded operations. More than that, Margaret's joy at seeing her brother was unmistakable. "We've got a bunk room that's not being used," Ethan said carefully. "Works hard, and the pay's not much." "I'll take it," Patrick said quickly. I want to be near family again. Real family." And so their household grew by one. Patrick proved to be everything he'd promised: hard-working, quick to learn, respectful. He and Ethan developed an easy relationship, and Margaret glowed with happiness at having her brother near. It was Patrick who inadvertently changed how the town saw them. At the general store one day, he overheard 2 women gossiping about that mail-order bride who'd caused all the trouble. "That's my sister you're talking about," he said firmly. "And she's the finest woman in this territory. Saved my life by taking me in. Saves others by nursing them when they're sick. Saved this whole valley by standing up to those who'd destroy it. Maybe you should judge people by their actions, not their circumstances." The women had the grace to look ashamed, and the story spread quickly. Patrick's fierce defense of his sister, combined with the memories of Margaret's courage during the attack, began to shift perceptions. The whispers faded, replaced by nods of respect. One afternoon, as Margaret worked in her flourishing garden, she heard a commotion from the road. A wagon had overturned, spilling a family's belongings across the dusty track. Without hesitation, she ran to help, finding a young couple with 2 small children, the woman cradling a baby.
Please,
The woman gasped.
my baby, she's burning up with fever.
Margaret took charge immediately. Sending Patrick for Doc Whelan and Ethan to right the wagon, she brought the family inside. Using cool cloths and her growing knowledge of frontier remedies to bring the baby's fever down. By the time Doc arrived, the crisis had passed. "You've got healing hands," Doc Whelan told her approvingly. "Ever think about learning more? I could use an assistant, especially for the women and children who are sometimes shy about seeing a male doctor." The idea took root in Margaret's mind. She began spending 1 day a week with Doc Whelan, learning about medicines and treatments, discovering a natural aptitude for healing. The children who'd already called her Mama Margaret now came to her with scraped knees and upset stomachs, trusting her gentle touch. "You're becoming the heart of this community," Ethan told her one evening as she prepared a tonic for the miller's colicky baby. "We both are," she corrected. "Do you know Tom Bradley told me yesterday that you're the man he trusts most in the valley said, if anyone could lead us into statehood proper, it would be you." Ethan ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise. "I just try to do what's right." "That's why they trust you." She crossed to where he sat, standing behind his chair to wrap her arms around his shoulders. "That's why I love you." As autumn deepened into winter, Margaret felt a change in herself. At first, she attributed the fatigue and queasiness to the busy harvest season. But when Doc Whelan made his diagnosis during one of her training sessions, she could hardly believe it. "About 3 months along, I'd say," he announced with a smile. "Congratulations, my dear." Margaret floated home in a daze. She found Ethan in the barn, showing Patrick how to mend harnesses. Both men looked up as she entered, immediately noticing her expression. "Margaret," Ethan was on his feet in an instant. "What's wrong?"
"Nothing's wrong,"
she said, then laughed a sound of pure joy.
"Everything's right. Ethan, we're going to have a baby."
The harness slipped from his hands.
"A baby."
"A baby," she confirmed. And then she was in his arms, lifted off her feet as he spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at once. Patrick whooped and threw his hat in the air. "I'm going to be an uncle, wait until I tell everyone." As news spread through the valley, gifts began arriving at the ranch, tiny quilts sewn by loving hands, carved toys from the German carpenter in town, preserves and advice from every mother within riding distance. The woman who'd arrived abandoned and alone now found herself surrounded by a community's love. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, Margaret sat by the fire updating her journal. So much had changed since that first desperate night in Ethan's cabin. The frightened mail-order bride was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found her strength, her purpose, her home. "What are you writing?" Ethan asked, settling beside her on the sofa, his hand coming to rest gently on the slight swell of her stomach. "The end of one chapter," she said, showing him the page, "and the beginning of another." He read her words about community and belonging, about love that grew from kindness, about finding family in unexpected places. "It's beautiful," he said, "but you're wrong about one thing." "What's that?" "This isn't the end of any chapter. This is the middle of the story. The best parts are still to come." As if in agreement, the baby moved for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings that made Margaret gasp with wonder. Outside, the snow fell softly, blanketing their ranch in peaceful white. But inside, all was warmth and light, and the promise of tomorrow. "You're right," Margaret said, leaning into her husband's embrace. "The best parts are still to come." 5 years had passed since Margaret stepped off that dusty stagecoach, and the Carter Ranch had transformed into something neither she nor Ethan could have imagined. The main house, expanded now with a proper parlor and children's rooms, stood as a testament to their perseverance. Gardens flourished where once only sagebrush grew, and the new barn, still called new, despite being 4 years old, sheltered a thriving herd. On this particular spring morning, Margaret stood at the kitchen window, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their third child grew, watching as Ethan taught their son William how to gentle a young colt. At 4 years old, William had his father's steady hands and storm cloud eyes, but his mother's quick smile and infectious laughter. "Mama, look!" 2-year-old Rose tugged at her skirts, holding up a handful of wildflowers she'd picked. Her red hair caught the morning sun, a perfect echo of her mother's. "Beautiful, sweetheart," Margaret said, lifting her daughter to see out the window. "Just like you." The sound of a wagon approaching drew their attention. Doc Whelan pulled up, but for once, this wasn't a medical visit. Beside him sat a distinguished-looking man in a city suit, unusual enough to make Margaret curious. "Mrs. Carter," Doc called out cheerfully. "Got someone here wants to meet you and Ethan. Says he's from the territorial governor's office." Ethan left William with Patrick, who'd grown into a capable young man and trusted foreman, and joined Margaret on the porch. The stranger introduced himself as Mr. James Morrison from the Capitol. "I'll get straight to the point," Morrison said once they were settled in the parlor with coffee. "The territory is pushing for statehood within the year. We need respected community leaders to help with the transition. Your names, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, came up repeatedly." Margaret and Ethan exchanged surprised glances. "In what capacity?" Ethan asked carefully. "Various roles, Mr. Carter. We'd like you to consider serving as a county commissioner. Your reputation for fairness and your success in building community cooperation haven't gone unnoticed." He turned to Margaret. "And you, Mrs. Carter, we're establishing a territorial board for education and public health. Doc Whelan says you're the best assistant he's ever had, and we know about your work teaching the local children." "I just help where I can," Margaret said modestly. "Which is exactly what we need." Morrison replied, "People who see a need and fill it, without waiting for government mandate." After Morrison left, promising to return in a month for their answer, Ethan and Margaret sat in thoughtful silence. William had crept in and climbed onto his father's lap, while Rose played with her doll at their feet. "It's a big responsibility," Ethan said finally. "Everything worthwhile is," Margaret replied, thinking of all the responsibilities they'd taken on each other. The ranch, their children, their community. That evening, the whole extended family gathered for supper, as was their Sunday tradition. Patrick was there with his new bride, Susan, a schoolteacher from Denver who'd come to visit her sister and never left. Tom Bradley and his family joined them, as did Doc Whelan and his wife. The table groaned under the weight of food, and the house rang with conversation and laughter. "Remember when this table had just 2 people at it?" Ethan murmured to Margaret as she passed with a fresh pie. "Lonely times," she agreed, pausing to kiss his cheek. "I prefer this chaos." After dinner, as the women cleared and the men discussed the upcoming cattle drive, young Sarah Bradley approached Margaret shyly, now 13 and on the verge of womanhood. She'd maintained her special bond with Mama Margaret over the years. "Mrs. Carter," she began hesitantly. "Mama says you came here as a mail-order bride. Is that true?" The room quieted slightly, though everyone pretended not to be listening. Margaret set down the plate she was washing and dried her hands thoughtfully. "Yes, it's true," she said simply. "I answered an advertisement and traveled here to marry a man I'd never met. But that's not who you married," Sarah pointed out. Glancing at Ethan, "No," Margaret smiled.
God had different plans.
Better plans. Were you scared coming all that way alone? Margaret considered the question, aware that her answer mattered. This girl, on the cusp of making her own choices, needed honesty. Terrified, she admitted. But sometimes the scariest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations. I could have stayed in Philadelphia, safe and empty. Instead, I took a chance on the unknown.
And found everything.
Sarah breathed, "Found myself," Margaret corrected gently. Everything else, Ethan. Our children. This life came from being brave enough to discover who I really was. Later, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Margaret found Ethan on the porch, his father's fiddle in his hands. He played a soft melody she recognized, the same one he'd played during their first storm together, when the future had seemed so uncertain. "We should accept Morrison's offer," she said, settling beside him.
You think so?
I know so. We've been given so much. Ethan, a chance to help shape this territory into a state, to make it a place where our children can thrive, where other women like me can find new beginnings. How can we say no? He set aside the fiddle and pulled her close. "When did you get so wise?" "Somewhere between learning to gather eggs without getting pecked and delivering my first baby with Doc Whelan." She laughed. "This place has a way of teaching you what matters." A sound from the barn caught their attention. Hope, now a mature cow with calves of her own, calling to her latest offspring. The name had proven prophetic in more ways than one. "Do you ever think about it?" Ethan asked suddenly. "What would have happened if Samuel hadn't rejected you that day?" Margaret shuddered slightly. "I try not to, but sometimes I think it had to happen exactly as it did. Every hard moment, every challenge, they all led us here. Even being abandoned."
Especially that. How else would I have found the man who would never abandon me?
They sat quietly, watching the stars emerge one by one, the same stars that had witnessed her arrival, frightened and alone, the same stars that had seen their first kiss, their wedding, the births of their children, constants in a world of change. "Papa, Mama," William's voice called from inside. "Rose is crying." The spell broken, they rose to attend to their daughter, but as they walked inside, Ethan caught Margaret's hand. "I need to tell you something," he said. "That first night, when I brought you here, I was just trying to do the right thing. I never imagined all this."
I know, Margaret said softly. Neither of us could have imagined it, but that's the beauty of it, isn't it? The best love stories aren't the ones that go according to plan.
They found Rose had simply had a bad dream, and soon she was settled between them in the big bed, with William climbing in as well, declaring he needed to protect his sister. As Margaret felt the baby shift within her, surrounded by her family in the house that love had built, she marveled at the journey that had brought them here. The next morning brought a letter that would cement their decision. It was from a young woman in Ohio, addressed to Mrs. Margaret Carter, formerly Miss Dawson. She'd heard Margaret's story through the network of mail-order brides and those considering the journey. She wanted advice should she take the risk. Should she travel west to marry a stranger? Margaret penned her response carefully. Asterisk. Dear Miss Hamilton, your letter found me on a spring morning, with my children playing at my feet and my husband working the land we've built together. You ask if you should come west, if you should take this chance. I cannot tell you what to do, but I can tell you this. The West will test you. It will strip away everything you thought you were and show you who you really are. Some days will be harder than anything you've imagined. You may face rejection, hardship, loneliness. But if you're brave enough to face those trials, if you're strong enough to bend without breaking, you may find what I found: not just a husband, but a partner, not just a house, but a home, not just survival, but a life worth living. Come with your eyes open and your spirit strong. Come ready to work, to learn, to grow. Come understanding that the life you plan may not be the life you get, but the life you get may be more beautiful than anything you dared to dream. Whatever you decide, know that there are women here who understand, who will help, who will welcome you. You are not alone. With warmest regards and hope for your future. Margaret Carter ***. As she sealed the letter, Margaret smiled. Whether Miss Hamilton came west or not, she'd spoken her truth. The abandoned mail-order bride had become a beacon for others, proof that even the rockiest beginnings could lead to the happiest endings. That evening, as she updated her journal now in its 3rd volume, Margaret wrote, "Today marks 5 years since I arrived in Cedar Ridge, carrying nothing but hope and desperation. I was abandoned before I even began, left standing in the dust with nowhere to go. But in that abandonment, I found liberation. In that rejection, I found acceptance. In that ending, I found my beginning. Tomorrow, Ethan and I will accept positions that will help shape this territory into a state. Our children will grow up not as outsiders, but as founders. The ranch that once teetered on the edge of ruin now stands as proof that with love, work, and faith, anything can flourish. To anyone who reads this, know that your story isn't over when things don't go as planned. Sometimes the closed doors are just redirecting you to where you were always meant to be. I was abandoned at that stagecoach stop. Yes, but I was also found. Found by a good man, found by a community, and most importantly, found by myself. This isn't the end of our story, just the end of this chapter. The next pages are blank, waiting to be filled with whatever adventures come next, and I can hardly wait to write them." Outside, she heard Ethan calling the children in for bed. Patrick's laughter echoed from the bunkhouse where he and Susan were planning their own family. The ranch settled into evening peace, complete and whole and home. Margaret closed her journal and stood, one hand pressed to where new life grew within her. She thought of the woman she'd been scared, proper, clinging to respectability. That woman never could have imagined this life, but this woman, shaped by the frontier and strengthened by love, couldn't imagine any other. "Coming, Mrs. Carter." Ethan appeared in the doorway, William on his shoulders and Rose in his arms. "Always, Mr. Carter," she replied, joining her family. "Always." The old wooden sign at the ranch entrance had weathered 5 years of sun and storm, but the words Ethan had carved remained clear: Carter Ranch, not for sale. It had become something of a local landmark, a symbol of perseverance in a land that tested everyone who dared to call it home. But to Margaret, it meant something more. It was a promise that some things weren't for sale, couldn't be bought or traded or abandoned. Things like love, family, home, things worth fighting for, worth building, worth keeping. As she tucked her children into bed that night, listening to their prayers that included thanks for horses and chickens and baby siblings yet to come, Margaret knew that every challenge had been worth it. The abandoned mail-order bride had found her place, her purpose, her happily ever after. And it was just the beginning. Thank you all for listening to this story of love, perseverance, and new beginnings in the Wild West. I hope Margaret and Ethan's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Are you driving through the countryside, relaxing at home, or perhaps even somewhere out west where stories like this really happened? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more stories of romance, adventure, and the pioneering spirit that built America. Hit that like button if Margaret's courage inspired you. And please consider pressing the hype button to help more people discover these stories of hope and second chances in the American frontier. Until our next story, remember, sometimes the greatest adventures begin when our original plans fall apart. Happy trails, everyone.